Thanks for joining us in 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Well, the holidays are here, and that means lots of baking. Cookies, cakes, candy, you name it. There's just one problem with that here in Colorado. Our altitude can make baking an extra headache sometimes. But don't fret. We've got two experts to help you navigate our tricky Colorado altitude this holiday baking season. We spoke with Elisa Shackleton, a research associate and extension specialist at Colorado State University, and Marisa Bunning, a professor and extension specialist at CSU, about how to handle those holiday cookies at altitude.
Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. It's, of course, the holiday season. Let's say you just moved here. You're baking some holiday cookies, some Christmas cookies. You just can't seem to get them right. And maybe the altitude is playing a factor into all that. Maybe there's some special high altitude recipes to improve those holiday treats. And for a bit more on some of those, we're now joined by high altitude baking specialists, Marisa Bunning, as well as Elisa Shackleton from Colorado State University, extension specialist Elisa Shackleton, as well as an associate professor in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition, Marisa Bunning. Thank you both so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I guess the first question off the top of my head for both of you is, what is the biggest mistake you see from people who might be new here in terms of those holiday treats?
I would say, because it happened to me, is thinking that the recipe that you brought from lower elevations was going to work the same way it had been working for you for years, because it won't usually. And if you're a musician or an artist or a woodworker and you move to higher elevations, you may not see a difference in your skills. But if you're a baker and you come up to above 5,000 feet, you'll start to see some real differences when you're baking cookies, cakes, pies, and breads. So, Elisa, how about your take?
Yeah, I think cooking in Colorado, it's less forgiving. When we do baking at lower elevation at sea level, you can, kind of not be too careful about the ingredients. But I think the biggest thing is the using too much flour. The flour is really dry in Colorado. And so I think people get into trouble with flour. That's where I'm going to head.
So the climate may play as much of a factor in it as well, right? So you're saying the flour is too dry here in Colorado. So let's say you're coming from the East Coast or even the West Coast, that the amount of humidity could also play a role in terms of why those cookies might be getting messed up here?
Yes. Yeah. And so, the basic three things that happen at higher elevation are the leavening gases expand faster. So if you think about it, everything's like rising really fast. And then the moisture evaporates faster. So things are drier because we're having moisture evaporate. And then water and liquids boil at lower temperatures. So all the little food science things are happening. Those three are happening simultaneously. And we as bakers have to figure out like how to control those.
Sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say that, at our higher elevation, we have less atmospheric pressure. So leaveners can react with more force than they do. So you see breads rising faster, and maybe rising so fast that their structure won't set. And this will happen with cakes too, so they'll fall. But as Elisa said, once you understand the science behind it, then you can make some adjustments and steer it in a better direction.
Okay. And so what are some of those adjustments that we ought to make in general?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, go ahead, Marisa.
So I was going to say, you started with flour, so I think that's huge. Why don't you tell us about that?
So one of the things we would highly recommend is make sure you're buying a pretty high protein flour, because since it's going to rise really fast, it needs to be stronger. So you want a flour, like an all-purpose flour that's at least, say, 12 to 14% protein. So buying the cheaper flour at the grocery store is probably not doing you any favors as a Colorado baker. So you do want a higher protein flour. And then also you want to make sure you're measuring your flour right. We should not be scooping and dipping it into the flour. You really want to spoon it into the measuring cup and level it off. So otherwise you'll be measuring too much flour for the recipe that you're doing.
And I will go for the liquid issue here, because again, at our higher elevation, drier climate, you have faster evaporation. So it's often a good idea to slightly increase liquids so you can counter that problem that's occurring.
And I've read as well that you both recommend taking detailed notes, right? So it's, if you're just coming here, you're trying to adjust for that recipe. I suppose this is fairly obvious, but since we only use holiday cookies and holiday treats once a year, you probably want to take really detailed notes so that way you remember the next year, right?
Exactly. Good idea. Right in the margin.
And usually you want to try making only 1 or 2 adjustments at a time, so that you can make good progress, because depending on what you're making, there may be recommendations like slightly increasing the oven temperature, so it can help set the structure of whatever you're baking a little faster. But again, you've got to be careful with that. And the other reminder that we often think about here is mindful measuring, because I know how hectic things are at the holidays, and you might be like just kind of getting pretty close with that cup of flour. But if you kind of slow down and pay attention to that measuring, just to make sure that you've got it as close as possible to the recipe, you'll probably have better results.
Okay, some good advice there. So let's say, Elisa, I know you're at higher elevation, but let's say you're heading from Denver, from Front Range up to the mountains to do some, I don't know, you get an Airbnb or whatever it is, you got a house up there to do some of that baking up that way. You have to adjust from Denver to the higher terrain as well, don't we?
Absolutely. And I am based in Leadville, which is the highest city in the United States. So I get to do the extreme baking. And what I would say in general, if people want to write down like the 3 important things that if you do these, you probably will have success. The first one is decrease the leavening. So if it has baking powder or baking soda, decrease it, they say, by about 1/8 to 3/4 per teaspoon in the recipe. And there's women up in the Leadville area that actually don't even add any leavening anymore. So the recipe might call for baking soda or baking powder. They just don't even put it in, because again, this atmospheric pressure being so decreased, everything's just rising really fast. So decrease your leavening, just do that automatically, and that helps a lot. Also, you can decrease sugar and fat by about 1 to 3 tablespoons per cup that's called for in the recipe. And I think that's kind of a cool perk to living in Colorado, is we can have awesome baked goods that are actually lower in fat and sugar, and they are just as tasty and delicious as somebody making, that higher fat, higher sugar recipe at sea level.
Huh.
So those are the 3 things: decrease your fat a little bit, your sugar a little bit, and your leavening. And you will probably have amazing results just by doing those 3 things.
And I'm going to throw in another suggestion, and that's, especially if you're not baking very often, check all your ingredients. You really want high quality ingredients when you're putting the time, and effort and money into baking. So check on that baking powder, baking soda, and even flour has a date, especially if it's whole wheat flour. So just check to make sure you're using the best ingredients, so you can be sure that you've got a quality product.
Awesome. I guess maybe on the topic of holiday treats and recipes, you also advise not to sample raw dough, correct? That can also lead to some maybe not so pleasant results.
Chris, thanks for bringing that up. Absolutely. And many people may think that is because raw dough often contains eggs, and that can be an issue. But it's not just the eggs that might be contaminated. There have been some outbreaks, and research has been done to show that flour can be contaminated. So yes, thanks so much for mentioning that. I was going to bring up food safety, but that's an excellent point that we definitely push it.
I've done that in the past a few times with some unpleasant results. So, but I think it really is a good reminder, because I think that it's a little tempting, right? I mean, it can be tempting to do it, and it's not such a good idea, is it?
Yeah, not after you've read about the outbreaks. You're not as tempted anymore. Yeah. And that's I would say that's always important, especially when you're baking for other people, to bring out your best food safety skills. Put on your apron, pull back your hair, put away your cell phone, give yourself a really, clean workspace. It's holiday baking is fun. So, kind of really take a full on approach to it.
I love that. I guess I'll leave this with either of you, and any final tips, tricks for high altitude baking that you want to leave us with?
Yeah. So one thing you didn't ask about was candy. And a lot of people like to make toffees and caramels and peanut brittles. And one of the things they may not know is it at higher elevation, you need to decrease the finished temperature. So you actually don't have to get it as hot as the recipe calls for. And the measurement is you decrease by 2 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet you are above sea level. So for instance, at 10,000 feet, I dropped my finished temperature of toffees by 20 degrees. So
Wow.
2 degrees for every 1,000 feet above sea level. So my recipe calls for 236 degrees Fahrenheit to finish my candy, but I just cook it to 216. So people don't realize it, and they just keep cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking, and all that sugar is, crystallizing and the water is evaporating, and they end up with a mess. So it's another beautiful thing about being in Colorado is we can cook things, to a lower temperature.
And I'm going to add in a couple of other tips, especially for cookie baking. And one is using parchment paper on cookie sheets, and that might help to keep the dough from spreading as much. But it also can conserve water because you may not have as much cleanup afterwards. And then the other tip is that might work for some recipes is to chill the cookie dough. Go ahead and form it into small pieces, but chill it first, and that will also help slow the spread in the oven.
Those are great tips, very useful. I've learned things aside from not just eating, not eating raw dough. That's I assure you learned things other than that. I especially enjoyed that candy bit as well, because I love my candy as well. But anyways, Marisa, Elisa, thank you so much for joining us here in 9 Plus, giving us some of that insight, and hopefully making the holiday season a bit tastier for everybody here at our unique high altitude. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.